Okay. All right. So, Gary, if you could just share your screen and then run your presentation and talk over it.
Okay, can I say a few words first?
Yes, of course you can.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity, second time in, what, 4 months to try to get some of my story out. Not all firsthand, but a lot of stuff. For example, the slides I'll be showing today. I've been to 98% of the places, so I tend to learn by creating maps and as ways to jog my memory, to do further research. I don't know if I think that's pretty common, but I'm really humbled by the opportunity to speak to you guys. When I look at the stuff you do, it's intimidating. Like, maybe I'm not going to have anything new for you guys because you've been digging so much. But at any rate, I'm sure there's some things that you may have overlooked that I can talk about. So let's go.
Isn't it going to present, Gary?
Speaker.
So this is the presentation. Oh, you got it. Yeah, we got it.
Yeah, that's showing, Gary.
Okay.
I think you got up to page 25 or 26 before. Is this a new PowerPoint you've got today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, present. There you go.
Okay. Here we go. Got about 20 slides, and I don't know how many of you were in New York. I assume quite a few, but at any rate, I dedicated what I said in New York to an American by the name of Ron Ridenour that discovered the My Lai massacre. And he's the one that, when I was in New Orleans in '88 for a teachers convention, met with him for a few hours. And he's the one that kind of opened up what New Orleans was like in terms of the corruption that exists with the Marcellos, especially. So here, Garrison, as the caption says, is announcing the arrest of Clay Shaw. Now, you guys know a lot about Clay Shaw, so it's I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him, but just assume that everything I'm talking and showing in the slides, as far as I can tell, he knew about most of it prior to arresting Clay Shaw in '67. And so a lot of the stuff he just couldn't use to try and convict Clay Shaw, but he, as far as I know, he did. He was in the loop. Now here's this slide. You can see it says Lee Harvey Oswald quoted, "I'm a Marxist," and the three people at the bottom, Hale Boggs, a congressman, and I'm sure you've heard of this guy, but you may not know a lot about him. Dr. Alton Ochsner was a part of the ultra-right in New Orleans and did a lot of financing of activities. And this is Ed Butler, who was the head of INCA, the right-wing propaganda production organ. So these are three prime characters that I think were really instrumental in concocting their part of the assassination of JFK. Now, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago when I was in New Orleans visiting my son. I went to this art gallery right in the French Quarter. The French Quarter isn't all strippers and booze. It actually has art galleries and expensive antique stores, and it's quite a heady place. So here on the wall was a record album that they had framed in this art gallery. I was kind of had my antenna out to see what evidence there was at that point, 56 years later, when I was there for about the 8th, 10th time. And I didn't really know what this was at the time, but on the back of this album, Self-Portrait in Red, are the 3 gentlemen that I just showed you in the previous slide. And I don't know, I'm sure this as a collector's item is worth a bit of money these days, but it was just a random thing. And I can't say that there was a lot of evidence historically of Oswald's presence. Last May, when I spoke to you, I did show a metal plate attached to a bar a block from Oswald's house that said Oswald sat here. And so that was, as far as physical things, probably the only 2 things I've ever found. Now, this is a layout of the New Orleans is referred to as a fertile crescent, or not the Fertile Crescent, the Crescent City. Got my hemispheres messed up there a little bit. But you can see the Mississippi running from the top here down around, and it's a crescent. So, of course, there are other loops in the river to create other crescents, but this is definitely a crescent shape for this part of New Orleans. And you can see that there's many significant places here. Let's see if I can use a pointer. The other thing is this visible from where many of you are sitting?
Yeah.
It's okay?
Yeah, it's fine. Got it.
Okay. So the main subject of this talk is Dr. Mary Sherman. This is where she lived. And I remember standing out in front of the place just to get a mental image of who she was. Here is something called the Big Lab, which is a linear accelerator to do cancer research, where she was employed as a cancer researcher, and her boss was a guy named Alton Oxner, who I showed 2 slides ago, and he lived here. And this was actually the National Institute of Health, where it is believed the accelerator was located. Now, apparently she would travel between London or Oxford, where there was an accelerator, and back to this accelerator, or wherever it was in New Orleans, because they've never really found the evidence of an accelerator other than a lot of heavy wiring in a building I'll show you later. Now, here's Loyola University. There's many Loyolas, but this is maybe one of the more famous ones in New Orleans. Here's the Tulane University, where Oxner was actually a professor until professor in the Tulane Medical School until he left to form his own hospital. Here's David Ferry's apartment, and this says Ferry's Little Lab, a couple blocks away. And this is called the Mouse House. And he didn't have too many mice in his own apartment, but he was close to where he could fill an apartment with, some say, up to 400 cages with mice that he was trying to inject cancer cells into. Now we go this way, I don't know, this is maybe from Oswald's apartment going this way by trolley. You come to Guy Bannister's office, Riley Coffee, and of course, right next to Riley Coffee would be the parking ramp where Adrian Alba was located that I focused on back in May. And here you can't see this, but I don't know, 6-8 blocks away is the headquarters of Inca, right on Canal, which is the main drag from the river front going this way through New Orleans. And let's see here. Okay. Now this is a shot from the 50s, 60s, I would guess, of downtown New Orleans. You can see canal that runs this way through the heart, with the French Quarter being, I guess it would be north of the business district. Here's 544 Camp Street, where Oswald had his office on the second floor of Bannister's office. And here's the Riley Coffee Company. And right here is Adrian Alba's parking ramp. So you can see, my point here is that there's a lot of stuff that's really close in this area. This square had lots of intelligence agencies in this federal building. I think there's a new federal building right here now. And so it was center of the vortex, I guess, for lack of a better term. Now here's the International Trade Mart, where Clay Shaw worked for a number of years. And it now has moved to about right here. And I think even though it's in a 20-30 story building right here, it is probably occupying just a part of the skyscraper. And whereas over here, where Oswald was passing out leaflets in front of the Trade Mart, I think it probably took up the whole building with businesses that were engaged in international trade. This is WDSU, the radio station where Oswald did his interview that ended up being on the album that I showed you a few slides back. And of course, that was owned and operated by some right-wing people. Probably the Rileys were contributing. Now here's various pictures of David Ferry, which I'm sure you've all seen. I guess this is the most familiar with his bad eyebrows, and his hairpiece doesn't look so bad here, but I guess this must be the one that looked like a dead raccoon or something on his head. Shouldn't speak like that of the dead, but now here's let's see. I don't know what you see, but I see a black band here. Maybe if yeah, okay, I got rid of it. This is Ferry's apartment. Up here under this green bar. I don't know if you're seeing the green bar. Maybe I can get rid of it, but I don't want to take a chance. And here's his so-called little lab in a house a couple blocks away. I drove down that street and sat in front of Ferry's apartment probably 6 years ago. And I'm not sure I was aware of this one, is where he kept most of the mice for his experiments. Now, if you haven't already figured it out, a lot of this that I'm talking about comes from Ed Haslam, who wrote Dr. Mary's Monkey in I think his first edition was 95 and republished in 07. And I think it was at a COPA conference in Dallas where I met him and we had a discussion about the ideas in his book. So I've been aware of his thesis for a long time. Now, he admits they haven't found the particle accelerator. There's just circumstantial evidence, including the people working at Ochsner's medical system, that is very implicating and including Mary Sherman. Now here's David Ferry's house or apartment. This is a stairwell here. Somebody else lives down here. He's up on the top floor. This is where they found him dead in '67 during Garrison's investigation. Now this is Dr. Ochsner himself, and being from North Dakota, whenever I hear about somebody that's become famous from North or South Dakota, I tend to pay attention. And we in North Dakota, along the state that's along the Canadian border, south of Winnipeg, which you've heard of, is South Dakota. And it's like North Carolina and South Carolina having a feud with each other, especially when it comes to football games, I suppose. But Ochsner came from Kimball, South Dakota, which is now a town of about 600 people. And he, at the end of high school, headed off for the medical school at the University of South Dakota and spent 2 years and then transferred to a university in St. Louis to finish his medical training. And he became good friends with the Mayo brothers of the Mayo Clinic, and decided when he got an appointment or got a professorship at Tulane in New Orleans, that if he ever started a medical facility, he would model it after the Mayo brothers, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, which is, I don't know, it's kind of the Disneyland of the medical world. I've been there for reasons that I'd rather not have gone there for. Speaking of prostate cancer, but it's an amazing place. And, Ochsner became famous in New Orleans once he started his own hospital for being the surgeon for the dictators. There's a book by that name. And he specialized in going back and forth from the Central and South America to take care of the dictators, because he was an ultra right winger. And somebody said, brilliant as a surgeon, but once somebody gets out of their specialty and tries to get political, some of them just go off the rails. And apparently that's what he did, depending on your politics. But I think that's a fairly accurate statement. But here he was in another pamphlet or whatever, The Death of a Smoker. He was instrumental in getting smoking to be what we now understand as a cause of cancer. When one puts a bullet in his head, it is cheap, painless, and quick, he says. When one commits suicide by smoking, it is prolonged, painful, and expensive. So obviously he cared about people's health and was quite famous in New Orleans. When you drive around New Orleans, it's Oxnard this, Oxnard that. Clinics, satellite clinics, emergency rooms. It's pretty amazing that he's left that mark. And his son, who followed him at those clinics, is also now gone. And I don't know if that son has any sons that continued in the New Orleans medical scene. But again, the reason I'm bringing up him especially is his presence, and what we're trying to talk about here is the climate, the environment in New Orleans in the 60s. And so he was really creating the parameters of what was going on in New Orleans in terms of right-wing politics and working with anti-Castro Cubans, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't understand New Orleans without understanding him, is what I guess I'm saying. He even built something called the Brent House for visiting South American, Central American dictators. And I never saw this. If I saw it, I didn't know what it was, even though there must be a sign like this in front. But, you know, pretty elaborate digs for the visiting people. Now, it's interesting that the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, which I'm about 90 miles from, caters to Middle East oil sheiks. And when you're walking through there, all the buildings are connected underground, and it's really strange to see all the Middle Eastern sheiks shopping in the underground shopping plazas as they're waiting to get medical treatment. So I guess between Oxnard and Mayo, they had that in common. I don't think the Mayos were right wing, which is a big difference. Now here's, if you can see up here, it says Tulane Delta Primary Research Center. What you see here are all cages for primates, monkeys, that the Tulane Medical School, where he was employed until he broke away, was doing research on primates to see if they could find a cure, a vaccine for cancer. And at one point, he was sure that the polio vaccine that they had come up with on their way to trying to find a cancer vaccine was safe, and he injected 2 grandchildren of his, and his granddaughter got really sick. I don't know if she actually lost the use of limbs, but at any rate, she recovered. But his grandson passed away from the injection of that vaccine for polio. So I don't know a lot about whether he really crashed at that point. And I mean, he kept on doing his political stuff, apparently. But I drove across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans, probably on this road right here. And I don't think I was aware that it was right next to this highway that I came across Lake Pontchartrain on. I also went the other way along the north shore of Pontchartrain to see if I could find the guerrilla training area where the anti-Castro Cubans were practicing guerrilla warfare, as you see in the movie JFK. Now, this is Dr. Mary Sherman. She was childless, and she would, because of that, she would go across Lake Pontchartrain, where I just showed the primate center, and she would go to a children's hospital to do whatever she could to make them feel like they were going to be helped, I guess. And so she really was a good person. And yet she got very close to David Ferry and Oxner. And so could be her politics were fairly right wing. Now, some of these pictures are really bad, but this is where she lived. And I think there's a horseshoe balcony here. And I think she lived over on this side. And that's where she was found murdered. And in July of 64, just say 8 months after the assassination. And I stood in front of this 3101 St. Charles Avenue. And there was a gate, so you couldn't get in. But at any rate, to this day, it's an unsolved murder. And it could have been a burglary, but everything points to something more extreme than that. And I'll show you in a minute what that is. So here was the New Orleans States, I don't know what the last word in the name of the newspaper is, but when she was killed, Orleans woman, surgeon, slain by intruder, body set on fire, clues lacking in killing of Dr. Sherman. So it was a big deal. She was world famous as a cancer researcher. She had gotten most of her training at the University of Chicago Medical School, which is top notch, even though it's not on the coast like Harvard or someplace. It's considered to be one of the more prestigious universities in the country. And she migrated to New Orleans from Chicago. Let's see. Okay. This is what I mean by more extreme. Now, I only have, there's other pictures, but one is enough, I think. And they couldn't figure out how the bedclothes catching fire could have done this to her body. And that's where Ed Haslam, who, by the way, I'm going to not leave this on the screen, I don't think. Ed Haslam grew up in New Orleans, and he remembers the day she was killed, his dad coming home for lunch and being very upset because his colleague, Mary Sherman, he was also employed as a surgeon at Tulane, was found dead. And Ed Haslam was just, I think 12, 13 years old, and he never forgot it. But he left it for years and then came back to it, and for whatever reason got very curious and started trying to understand how she could have been burned like that. He'd call the county medical examiner and places where people were cremated, and what he found out was that bones don't burn. And a lot of her bones on that side of her body were gone. And so you had to have an extremely hot electrical charge or something like that going through her that would literally have fried that side of her body. Her heart was still beating, according to the autopsy, and she ended up being found in her apartment. But the theory is that this was the location of the linear accelerator. And I tried to get close to it. The closest I could get was the street out here, Chapatulas, great name. And there's a brick wall running all along the street surrounding it. And I stood there with my wife, I don't know, 10 years ago now. And there was a door here, and there was an electronic lock, and I did see a guy go in. And why there when he could have parked here? This is the National Institute of Health, NIH. And you can see here, there's some kind of a connection to this building. This chimney is about 100 feet tall. And you would guess that it's a power plant that runs the electrical supply for this huge building. This is about 6-7 stories. And these, if you have a closer look at this, it's all pipes above ground running into the NIH. Now, some people even go so far as to say the accelerator was over here and it was being fed power from the power plant. Other people say, no, it was in here and the power was going through these conduits. And I assume they were above ground because this is a block from the Mississippi River and the water table is probably quite high. And it might be tricky to have important electrical power systems buried in the ground. Just an aside here, you see these are residential houses. And if you've been to New Orleans, you know they call them shotgun houses, simply because they're all built close and long. And in May, I showed you Oswald's house, which is now a law office, which is one of these shotgun houses. And I got a tour of it, and yeah, it's really long with a central hallway. And you can actually, when I was there here, you can actually Airbnb these, or a few of them. But at any rate, the particle or the linear accelerator has never really been found here, but when I was there 8 years ago or so, it looked abandoned. And what Ed Haslam discovered was real heavy duty wiring. Now, I'm not an electrician, so I know nothing about what that could mean. He's convinced that it meant that a linear accelerator simply needed that kind of over-the-top power supply. And as far as I know, they've never proven that there could be a linear accelerator here, but they're convinced that it was someplace in New Orleans. And this is the best candidate. And the fact that Mary Sherman was working using a linear accelerator to break apart viruses, as I understand it, monkey viruses. Is some circumstantial evidence about why that could be. Now, here's a picture. I don't know if you can see this very good. This looks like a horizontal linear accelerator. And 1960s vintage Van der Graaf linear accelerator on the workbench. Now, I don't know what that workbench comment means if it hasn't been installed yet, but you can see here that it looks like it's installed vertically and needs a 3-story building. And I didn't have room for the slide to show the beam coming out the bottom and being split and going through a titanium reflector, as best I can understand it. But the building that I showed you, where they think the accelerator was, is 3 stories. So it ostensibly could have fit in there. And I guess we'll never know because somebody like Ed Haslam isn't around to keep digging. So this is it from outside. And this is the 3rd floor. And this huge chimney is indicative of a power plant, but doesn't, and here's the brick wall that surrounds the whole area. So here's, like I said, it's got to be 100-foot chimney, which a lot of power plants have, obviously. And so I don't think they've found a better location. I mean, it's at a research facility, the National Institute of Health, and somebody said because it's under federal, because she may have been killed here, her murder was under federal jurisdiction, not local jurisdiction or state jurisdiction. So the feds proceeded to shut down the investigation of her murder soon after she was killed. And Haslam kept running into brick walls and just could not penetrate what the feds were doing in terms of their cover-up. So I think with 10, 15, 20 minutes to go, maybe I'll stop there and open for questions or reactions, comments.
Gary, in I don't know whether you believe, a lot of people don't, Judith Berry Baker, in her book Me and Lee, I can remember reading about.
I can't hear you.
I'll repeat the question, Stuart, but try and
Okay.
be as loud as you can.
Judith Berry Baker, in her book Me and Lee, she talks about the time that Oswald was actually involved in cancer research, working with Berry and no doubt Mary Sherman. But in that book, she actually talks about a visitor who was expected, a very important visitor who turned out in the book to be Jack Ruby. Do you believe that Jack Ruby could have visited New Orleans at that time and met Oswald?
Did you hear the question, Gary?
Yeah, I heard. I don't doubt it, considering that I think he had business in New Orleans in the French Quarter for starters, and there was also gun running going on from the Homa area with Schlumberger. I think I mentioned in May that I had driven out to Homa to see if I could find any Schlumberger factories, and I did, and they were very large and could have easily been a weapons depot that Jack Ruby was interested in greasing the skids for to get on their way to Cuba through the port of New Orleans, or overland for that matter, to go to Florida and then off to Cuba. So yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a good chance that he was operating there. Anybody else?
Yes, Scott Reeder's got a question.
It's really
Hi, Scott.
really following on from what Stuart said, because you mentioned Oshner and Sherman, Ferry, etc. But Judith Baker's kind of like a big part of the New Orleans story. And without being too controversial, I just wondered what your perspective was on Judith and her,
Okay, yeah,
testimony, if you like.
do you remember we covered this? This question came up at the end of the session in May, Gary. If you recall it.
I vaguely remember that. Could you just give me a quick?
I think really Scott is asking, what is your perspective on Judy Baker? I know you met her, didn't you?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to, John Williams, who's spoken on your Zoom, a couple years ago, I think now. He spent about 5 years in a phone connection with her, and he's convinced that I don't know if he mentioned it in his talk to you guys a couple years ago, but he's convinced that she's for real. I guess I'm agnostic to the extent that she's got some eccentricities that once you get past, and I may have said this in May, her memory, it must be a photographic memory because, and of course that would enable her to concoct a story that seemed to be totally real. I guess that's one way to look at a photographic memory, or a memory of a genius type. But there's, a lot of people have poked holes in her stuff. I don't think there's any doubt that she was a child prodigy at her high school in Bradenton, Florida, to actually get her to Buffalo, New York as a high school student to be trained in cancer research. And then she was discovered at a science fair in her home in Florida in Bradenton. And there was a doctor at the University of Minnesota named Dr. Diehl, Diehl, I believe. And he was connected to Ochsner simply because Ochsner was the head of the American Medical Association or Cancer Association, one of those. And so they were at a conference in Florida, and Dr. Diehl ended up interacting with Judith's high school science project, and was impressed and told Ochsner about it. And that's how Ochsner ended up inviting her to New Orleans and as I understand it, the rationale is, why would Ochsner find a high school kid, prodigy or not, to be involved in a secret project to invent a virus to get injected into Castro. And it was, as I understand it, because she was safe. Nobody would suspect her of being involved at that young age. So there are those kinds of things that even Ed Haslam thinks are important. Now, Jim DiEugenio is highly impressed by Haslam's research. DiEugenio simply says, I wish he hadn't gotten so involved with Judith Baker, because DiEugenio doesn't have time for her story, I guess. So I don't know. It's about all I can say now. Does that help?
Yeah, Johnny Cairns has got a question, Gary.
Hi, Gary, how you doing?
Hi, Johnny.
What do you think of Dr. Brown's book on Judith Baker?
Neil?
Yeah, Walt Brown wrote a book debunking Judy Baker's story, and Johnny wanted you to comment on that. What do you think of that book and the debunking?
Yeah, I need to read that. I interact with Walt online, and like I said in May, he was really upset when a few of us, John Williams, who's spoken to you, myself, and I think I said at that time that the other people who are more professional researchers than I am were speaking there. And I kind of misspoke when I said, well, you got to take advantage of every opportunity. Not meaning you should be an opportunist, but somebody like me who is not an established researcher, you know, if there's an opportunity to talk about one's own experience, then you go for it. So I told Walt that, and I don't, you know, we still talk, so I don't know if he is still upset. I do need to look at his book. You had another speaker, James Norwood, a professor at the University of Minnesota, again about 2 years ago, I think. And he has no use for Judith. And, you know, he taught course on the assassination for years at the University of Minnesota, a semester-long course. So he's one of the few people I've seen be as well read. I mean, you can ask him about anything, and he's got a perspective on it. So, you know, you have those extreme positions, that she was a hero, that she and Oswald were really trying to stop the assassination, and then you have others that say she's loony. I mean, I started interacting with her 25 years ago, after I had been at Adrian Alba's garage. And there were some things that didn't ring true about how she was meeting Oswald in part of the parking ramp. And so I pushed back, and we argued about whether or not she could have come from that direction to hang out with him during his breaks. So at that point, I really had a problem. Hadn't read any of, you know, I don't know where Me and Lee was at the time. I hadn't read it. I didn't know much about her other than her appearance. I think in 2000, she came out of the closet, so to speak, and started talking about her experience. So it was new to me at the time. But yeah, I'm going to have to read Walt's book.
I've got another
What's the
question.
best?
I've got another
We
question
are,
from Tony Austin, Gary.
yeah.
Does anybody have a theory as to why Mary Sherman was murdered, or is it still just a mystery?
Did you hear that?
Yeah. Well, I think that when she if you take the position that she was accidentally electrocuted by the linear accelerator by grabbing a lever that was to turn it on or off, and it was faulty or something, that the people that were with her late at night, that's when they would do their cancer research apparently, that they panicked, and who knows, Oshner could have been there. And they panicked because it would blow the cover on the CIA involvement in trying to create a toxin, a cancer-causing virus to get injected into Cuba or into Castro. And so that sounds pretty logical. And so when they panicked, they took her back to her apartment. And Haslam says the fact that she was stabbed, still alive, stabbed in the middle of her heart, somebody had to know that that was the coup de grace, that if they had to know where they could finish her off. I mean, she was so far gone at that point with half her body gone. I don't know how she could have been alive, but they claim, the autopsy claims she was. And so then they had to stage a fire and a burglary. And then various people, like her next door neighbor, Hispanic dude who seemed to be connected to the CIA. Can't remember his name now, but and she had a young, well, probably at the time not that much different in age than her, that committed suicide 13 years later. And he was a suspect because he worked with her, and there wasn't a case of a romantic kind of thing, but so you have the outright murder scenario versus the accidental version.
Thank you. Have another question from the floor from Mike Dworetsky.
Yes, Jack Ruby, when he was in prison and then later being kept in a hospital bed, wasn't he always saying something about how they're going to inject him with cancer? And how would he think that unless he knew something about injectable cancer viruses?
Right, right. Yeah, the only thing I can say, there was a conference at the University of Minnesota back in '99, and it was quite, I won't say circus, but it was quite something to see two of Ruby's strippers, if you want to include the babushka lady who was there. And, you know, they'd hang out in the hotel lobby. You could talk to them. I met babushka lady's mafia husband. Well, maybe that was in Dallas. At any rate, she was in Minneapolis. But another stripper, I don't know if it was Jada. You know, these are women that in '99 were in their 70s, it seemed like. But I said to her, so do you think Ruby was injected with cancer cells? She said, I went to visit him every day. And I was never present when anything happened, and he never said that they were doing that to him. So she was adamant that there were no cancer cells injected. And so the sense is that he got cancer at his age, not uncommon. Don't know, I forget what kind it was, but that's all I know.
Okay, we
Can
don't.
I,
Sorry, Gary.
if there aren't any, just let me, being I got through the slides without coming up short. Let me just say, and I've mentioned this at monthly talks, one talk with you guys back in May of 20. My claim to fame is I did your first Zoom talk, if you remember. So I'm pretty proud of that opportunity, that after meeting with Bart in London 5 years ago, and then we connected with a Zoom that I did. So I became fascinated by New Orleans because I wouldn't expect you to remember the story from 4 or 5 years ago, but when Oswald was interviewed in the Metropole Hotel by Elaine Mosby, who was working for the North American News Alliance, which was basically a CIA op, she got a memo about her meeting with Oswald back to the US and on the desk of Alan Belmont at FBI headquarters. Now, he was in charge of the investigation of the assassination. And at that point, it became misinterpreted as ND for North Dakota versus NO for New Orleans. And when John Armstrong connected me to his research, I thought, okay, well, he said, you're up there, you're in Minnesota, North Dakota, why don't you go digging? So John Williams and I did. And it intuitively, I get the feeling that Belmont saw the opportunity to frame Oswald in North Dakota. Of course, it fits in with Nagel's contention that the assassination was going to happen at the end of September. He got arrested on September 20th in order to avoid being a patsy himself. So he thought if he was in jail when the assassination happened 4 or 5 days later, that he'd be safe. Now, everybody, with the exception of the man who knew too much, you know, they say that Nagel was talking about Dallas. Well, Officer Bundren did not mention anything about Dallas until Nagel was arraigned a month or so later. So Nagel was actually talking about what he was privy to from his party in New Orleans with David Ferry and Oswald and Bannister at Ferry's house, where they were concocting the assassination. That's how he knew. And he didn't know that Kennedy was going on a cross-country conservation tour. And of course, I've been trying to understand if it's possible that Belmont could have seen the opportunity to turn it into North Dakota, because I found lots of evidence in North Dakota that Oswald had been there as a child. And the FBI came to investigate it and so on. Long story, but at any rate, that's how I came to be interested in New Orleans. And coincidentally, I get to go to New Orleans to see my son, who subsequently has moved back to Minnesota a year or so ago. So I may not ever get back there, but while I was going there for numerous times, I made the best of it in terms of being able to investigate various things. So just wanted to refresh people's memory that's my connection.
Okay, well, there are no more questions from the floor, Gary. Thank you very much indeed for appearing again.
Yep. Thank you very much, you guys. Keep up the good work. You're amazing.
And you've finished to the minute on time, so well done. That's great. All right. Well, thanks very much indeed, and we'll.
Yeah,
see you soon.
that's what you do when you're a high school teacher. You better be in the room when the bell rings and ready to leave when it rings again.
Absolutely. All right. Okay. Well, look, take care, Gary, and we'll have you back soon sometime. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.